When the damp chill of the North End Wharf finally broke the seal of the St. Agnes crypt in 2024, the urban explorers who found her weren't prepared. The convent above had been a ruin for decades, a hollowed-out shell of brick and broken stained glass, but the air that escaped the darkness below was different. It was cold still, and carried the scent of sealed time, of lime mortar and something metallic. The police were called, and in the beam of their flashlights, they found her. She was not laid out in ceremony. She was slumped against a damp stone wall, a skeleton still draped in the rotted black wool of a nun's habit. Her name, they would later learn, was Sister Maria Romano. She was 29 years old. In her skeletal right hand, she gripped a heavy iron rosary, its crucifix worn smooth. In her left, resting in her lap, was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages warped by moisture. And nestled beside her, gleaming dully in the light, was a rusted .38 revolver, its serial number filed away. The official story of her disappearance in 1953 was that she had simply walked away, a young nun overcome by a crisis of faith. But the crypt, the ledger and the gun told a different story. They whispered of a secret that the Boston underworld and the Catholic Church had conspired to bury 6 feet beneath the consecrated ground. How did a bride of Christ, a 29-year-old woman sworn to poverty and prayer, end up a prisoner in her own tomb? And what secrets were written in that book, secrets so powerful that they were worth sealing a nun in the dark? To understand the fate of Sister Maria, we must go back. We must go back to 1953, to a time when her uncle, Don Giulio Romano, ruled the North End with a serpent's smile and a butcher's heart. Don Giulio Romano was a man carved from the shadows he commanded. They called him the Serpent, not just for his cunning, but for the way he moved, silently, without warning, and always with deadly intent. His territory was the waterfront, the docks, and every street in the North End where the smell of stale beer and anisette hung in the air. His public face was the Café Venezia, a dimly lit social club where the espresso was thick and the loyalty was thicker. But the club's real business was conducted in the basement, a windowless room wallpapered in cigar smoke. Giulio was not a creature of impulse. He was a creature of absolute control. He believed in rules, but they were his rules, twisted reflections of the old Sicilian code. He prized family above all, not out of love, but out of a deep, paranoid need for possession. To be a Romano was to be his property, and to betray him was not just a crime, it was a sacrilege. His men feared him, but they also respected the brutal simplicity of his power. There was a story they whispered about Leo, the Bull Franca, a capo who had grown too proud, who had taken a cut just slightly larger than he was owed. Giulio didn't yell. He didn't send his soldiers. He invited Leo to Sunday dinner at his home. He served him wine, broke bread with him, and asked about his children by name. Then, as Leo's wife and children waited in their car outside, Giulio asked Leo to inspect a new wine cask in his cellar. Leo was never seen again. The next day, Giulio personally delivered a stipend to Leo's widow, kissing her forehead and promising to care for her family as Leo would have wanted. This was Giulio. His violence was intimate, his charity a threat. He was a man who understood that true terror didn't come from the gun. It came from the smile that preceded it. He held the North End in this velvet-gloved fist, and in the center of his web, placed there by his own hand, was his niece, the one piece of family he thought he could trust implicitly, hidden in the one place he believed was above suspicion, the convent of St. Agnes by the sea. The convent of St. Agnes was not a sanctuary. It was a cage of cold stone and penance, perched precariously on the edge of the Boston Wharf. The salt spray from the harbor misted its windows, crusting the sills like frost. The scent of low tide, of brine and decay, was a constant presence, mingling with the odor of floor wax and the faint, sweet smell of incense that never quite covered the damp. This was Sister Maria Romano's world. At 29, she was younger than most of the sisters, a stark figure of pale skin and dark woolen robes. But she was not just another nun, she was a Romano. The other sisters knew it. They whispered it in the refectory, their eyes averted. They saw the black car that idled outside the gates once a month, the one from which a thick-necked man would emerge to deliver an offering to the abbess. They felt the invisible wall of fear and privilege that surrounded Maria, a privilege she herself despised. Maria's cell was small, barely large enough for a cot, a wash basin, and a wooden crucifix. But beneath a loose floorboard, hidden under a stack of prayer books, she kept the only two items that tethered her to the world she had tried to escape: a fading photograph of her father, Don Vincenzo, and his silver cigar cutter. Her father had been Giulio's older brother, the true Don, a man of laughter, violence, and a strange, gruff kindness. His death, a sudden heart attack 10 years prior, had been the event that shattered her world and conveniently placed Giulio on the throne. Maria had sought refuge in the church, a desperate attempt to wash her father's sins and her family's name from her soul, but Giulio would not allow it. He had arranged her placement at St. Agnes, installing her like a spy, a loyal set of eyes in a place of God. He expected her to be his creature, his pious, silent observer. He had mistaken her piety for weakness. He had forgotten that beneath the habit, she was her father's daughter. She was a Romano, and she possessed the one thing Giulio truly feared. She was a flawless observer, and she saw everything. The memory that fueled Maria's silent war was sharp, a shard of glass in her mind. It was the day of her father's funeral, a cold, grey afternoon. She remembered Giulio, his face a mask of practiced grief, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. His comfort felt like a claim, like a snake coiling around its prey. His signet ring, the serpent eating its tail, felt cold against her skin. "I will take care of everything, cara mia," he had whispered, his voice thick with false sorrow. "You are family. You are my family now." From that moment, her grief had curdled into a cold, patient suspicion, and that suspicion had found an unlikely ally in Silas, the old groundskeeper at the convent. Silas was a ghost from her father's world, a man whose loyalty had been to Vincenzo, not to the Romano name. He had been his consigliere, a man of wisdom and silence. When Giulio took over, Silas was demoted, cast out of the inner circle and given a mop and a bucket, a living reminder of the old regime. But Giulio kept him close, a cat toying with a mouse. Silas now tended the gardens and boilers of St. Agnes, his silence a shield. He and Maria began to meet in the catacombs beneath the chapel, in the damp, hissing boiler room. Their conversations were whispers, veiled in allegory. "The garden is overgrown, sister," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "The new gardener plants weeds, they are choking the old roots." Maria, sorting altar cloths, would reply without looking up. "The weeds are strong, Silas, but they grow in poisoned soil." One night the pretense dropped. "He wasn't sick, Maria," Silas whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped a shovel. "Vincenzo, his heart was strong as a bull. The serpent has a long memory and a patient hand." In the oppressive, damp heat of the boiler room, the plan was born. It was not a plan for the police. Omerta was a law older than them all. It was a plan for the Commissione, the Council of Bosses in New York. Giulio was breaking the rules. He was growing too fast, too loud, too greedy, and Silas suspected he was committing the ultimate sin, the one that would bring the wrath of the other families down upon him. They just needed the proof. Maria's weapon was the confessional. The small dark box became the center of her web. St. Agnes was her uncle's preferred church. He forced his men to attend Mass, a performance of piety that amused him and laundered his reputation. And after Mass, one by one, the soldiers would shuffle into her confessional. They were not seeking divine absolution. They were seeking, in their own broken way, a moment of release from the terror of their lives. They were confessing to the Don's niece, hoping their performative loyalty would get back to him. They didn't realize she was listening. In the filtered darkness, through the carved wooden screen, she heard the whispers of their sins. "Bless me, sister, for I have sinned," a voice thick with whiskey would begin. It's about the shipments. At the wharf. The Don, he had us change the labels. It wasn't textiles, sister. It was," the voice would crack, "it was medicine. Penicillin, meant for the city hospital." Maria's blood ran cold, but her voice remained a placid, holy calm. "And this weighs on your soul, my son?" Another man, a young enforcer, trembled as he spoke. "He made us wait for a man in an alley. But we didn't just hurt him. The Don was there. He spoke to him, called him cousin. He said, blood is thicker than water. but not thicker than this pavement. He was killing his own, skimming from his allies, stealing from the sick. Each confession was a piece of a horrifying puzzle. Maria, with her angelic voice, would grant them absolution, her words a hollow comfort. "Go in peace, my son, and pray for the wisdom to follow God's path, not the path of greedy men." They would leave, feeling lighter, believing the sister was a simple, holy woman. They had no idea they had just sealed their boss's fate. They were confessing to God, but Sister Maria Romano was taking notes for the devil. With every whispered sin, Maria's secret grew. In the deepest hour of the night, long after the matins bell had fallen silent, she would descend into the boiler room. By the flickering light of a single greasy bulb, she retrieved her ledger. It was a thick accounting book, stolen from the convent's own scant supplies. But this book wouldn't track bushels of wheat or donations. It would track the decay of Giulio Romano's soul. Her penmanship was meticulous, the same steady hand that transcribed Holy Scripture. But the words she wrote were a map of the North End's underworld. She didn't use names. She used the coded language she and Silas had developed, a lexicon of saints and sinners. Leo Franca became St. Lawrence, the martyr roasted on a pyre. The stolen penicillin shipment was Lazarus's shroud. Giulio himself was the Serpent, or simply Genesis 3. She chronicled the dates, the amounts skimmed, the whispered confessions of betrayal. The book became her obsession, a dark mirror to her holy vows. It was a physical weight, a rectangular burden of sin she kept hidden beneath the floorboards of her cell, mere inches from her crucifix. The risk was suffocating. She lived in a constant state of managed paranoia. The abbess, a stern woman named Mother Superior Agnes, was deeply suspicious of her. The abbess prized order, and Maria, with her Romano name, was a living piece of chaos. One afternoon, the abbess made a surprise inspection of the cells. Maria was in the chapel praying when she heard the footsteps. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She returned to find her cell disturbed, her mattress slightly askew, her prayer books stacked imperfectly. The abbess had been there. Maria rushed to the loose floorboard. Her fingers fumbled with the wood. She lifted it. The ledger was still there. The abbess hadn't found it. But as Maria's pulse slowed, she noticed a small smudge of dirt on the book's leather cover, a smudge that had not been there before. The abbess had seen it. She had touched it. She had chosen for now to leave it. The message was clear. The convent walls had eyes, and Maria's sanctity was no longer a shield. Silas knew the ledger was not enough. Whispers and coded numbers were a start, but the commissione demanded proof that was cold and hard. The soldiers' confessions all pointed to a project beneath the convent, a place where Giulio was storing his investments. Maria, trapped by her vows and the abbess's watchful eye, could not investigate. It fell to Silas. He arranged a delivery of what he told the abbess was sacramental wine, a generous donation from a pious anonymous benefactor. The crates, heavy and sloshing, arrived on a Tuesday night during a thunderstorm that masked the sound of their truck. The abbess, eager for the donation, instructed Silas to store them in the old cellars, a part of the convent that hadn't been used in years, directly beneath the main chapel. This was his chance. After the nuns were asleep, Silas returned to the cellar, a crowbar and a flashlight his only companions. The air was thick with the smell of old wine, damp earth, and something else, something acrid, like rust and old chemicals. The cellar was vast, a labyrinth of stone arches. He found the wine crates easily, but he knew they were a distraction. He followed the smell. It led him to a section of the wall that looked newer than the rest. The mortar between the stones lighter, the craftsmanship sloppier, Giulio's work. He wedged the crowbar into a seam and pulled. The stones, a false wall, scraped loudly against the floor. Behind it was a yawning black hole, a set of steps leading down. He descended, his flashlight beam cutting the oppressive darkness. He was no longer in the convent cellar. He was in the original crypt, the one the church had sealed off in the 1800s, and Giulio Romano had reopened it. It was not a vault for money or contraband. It was a tomb. The beam of his flashlight found the first one. A man in a tailored suit, slumped against a barrel, his eyes open and vacant. Silas recognized him. a bookie from Providence who had argued with Giulio. He found another, a young dock worker who had seen too much. And then in the furthest, coldest corner, he found the one that made his blood freeze. A small, delicate frame, wrapped in a blanket. He knew instantly who it was. Isabella, a cousin, a Romano. Giulio had bragged she'd been sent back to Sicily after dishonoring the family. Silas had found Giulio's project. The Serpent wasn't just a gangster, he was a monster, hiding his family's skeletons directly beneath the house of God. Silas emerged from the crypt, his face the color of the stones he had just replaced. The stench of the tomb clung to him, a physical weight. He found Maria in the pre-dawn darkness of the chapel, kneeling before the altar. He didn't need to speak, she saw it in his eyes. He knelt beside her, his head bowed as if in prayer. "It is not a vault, sister," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It is a graveyard." He described what he had seen. The bookie, the dock worker, and Isabella. He described the smell of lime and decay. Maria's hands, clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, began to tremble. This was the sin. This was the proof. Killing rivals was business, but killing family and hiding them in a crypt, this was a sacrilege that would unite all the other Dons against Giulio. The Serpent had finally overreached. Maria knew they had to move, and fast. The ledger was now complete. The whispers from the confessional, the numbers from the shipments, and now the final horrific entry. Genesis 3, the crypt, Isabella, waiting. They had to get the ledger to New York. Silas had a contact, a truck driver who ran produce to the city, a man who still owed a debt to Maria's father. It was arranged. The handoff would happen in 3 days, but they had forgotten the first rule of hunting a snake. The Serpent is always more patient. The Serpent is always watching. Giulio Romano, for all his bluster, was a creature of profound paranoia. He had seen the way Silas looked at him. He had noticed the new, hard edge in his niece's pious gaze. He had seen the light in the boiler room at 3 a.m. He had seen the disturbed mortar on the cellar wall. He knew. He had simply been waiting, letting them spin their own noose. He had been letting them gather all his sins in one convenient place, so he could bury the sins and the sinners all at once. The delivery of the wine had not been Silas's idea. It had been Giulio's, suggested subtly to the abbess, who had then tasked Silas with it. The trap had been set weeks ago, and as Maria and Silas finalized their desperate plan in the chapel, Giulio sat in his social club sipping an espresso, his trap already sprung. The summons came not as a threat, but as an invitation. A young, nervous-looking soldier appeared at the convent gates just after Vespers, holding a bouquet of white lilies. "From your uncle, sister," he stammered, refusing to meet her eyes. "He requests your presence for dinner, a family matter." Maria's blood turned to ice. The lilies, she knew, were for funerals. This was not an invitation, it was a command. To refuse would be to admit her guilt and would endanger Silas immediately. She had to go. She told the abbess it was a family emergency, a lie that the old woman accepted with a knowing, cold stare. As Maria was led to the black sedan, she saw Silas watching from the garden, his face a mask of dread. She gave him a short, sharp nod, a final, silent order. Get the book out. No matter what. The ride to the Café Venezia was oppressive. The soldier beside her reeked of fear and cheap cologne. The North End streets passed by like a funeral procession. When they arrived, the club was empty. The lights were low, the tables bare. The only sound was a scratchy opera record playing softly in the corner, and at the back table, sitting alone, was Don Giulio. He did not look angry. He looked sad. A profound, theatrical melancholy. "Maria, cara mia," he said, standing to kiss her cheek. His skin was cold. "You look thin. This life, it doesn't suit a Romano." He poured her a glass of red wine, which she did not touch. "You have been a disappointment to me," he said softly, as if scolding a child. "I gave you a sanctuary. I protected you, and you have been listening to the whispers of ghosts." He gestured, and from the back room 2 of his men dragged a chair. Silas was tied to it, his face beaten, his breathing shallow. He was conscious, but barely. Maria's facade of calm broke. a gasp escaping her lips. "He is old, Maria," Giulio said, sipping his wine. "He fills your head with stories about your father, about me. All I have ever done is protect this family." He leaned in, his voice a predator's purr. "But you are a nun, a woman of God. You believe in absolution. So here is the choice, your old world or your new one." Giulio's eyes, dark and flat, held Maria's. He savored the moment, the perfect cinematic trap he had constructed. "This is simple, Cara," he continued, steepling his fingers. "Silas has confessed. He told me about the ledger, about your little plan to send my sins to New York." He smiled, a thin, cruel crescent. "He is a rat, and rats must be dealt with. But you are blood." He pointed to the bound and broken man. "He lives if you renounce this foolishness, if you give me the ledger, and if you, as a woman of God, give me your absolution. Right here. Tell me my sins are forgiven." This was the true test. He didn't just want the book. He wanted to break her. He wanted to desecrate her faith, to prove that her loyalty to him, to the family, was stronger than her loyalty to God. Maria looked at Silas, his one open eye pleading with her. She saw the truth. There was no deal. Silas was a dead man, no matter what she said. Giulio would never let him live. This was purely for her. This was a game, and Giulio was the only player. She turned her gaze from Silas to her uncle. The fear that had gripped her evaporated, replaced by a cold, pure clarity, a martyr's certainty. She stood up, her small frame radiating an authority that stunned the room into silence. She did not speak to Giulio. She spoke to Silas. "Silas," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with the authority of the chapel. "Requiem aeternam dona ei, Domine, et lux perpetua luceat ei. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him." She was not negotiating. She was administering his last rites. Silas, hearing the Latin, closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a path through the grime on his cheek. He understood. Maria then turned to Giulio, her eyes holding no fear, only a profound, chilling pity. "As for you, uncle," she said, "only God can absolve a sin of that magnitude." Giulio's sad father facade shattered. The theatrical mask fell away, revealing the raw, primal rage beneath. He had expected tears, begging, a negotiation. He had not expected faith. He had not expected a Romano to choose God over blood. He struck her across the face, a sharp, cracking blow that sent her staggering. "You," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury, "are no niece of mine." He nodded to his men. "Take him to the harbor. Make sure he sees the anchor." He then grabbed Maria by the arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. You will come with me. You want to be close to God? I will send you to him." He dragged her out of the club, leaving the opera record to play to the empty, smoke-filled room. The drive back to St. Agnes was a blur of terror. Giulio's silence was more terrifying than his rage. He didn't speak, his jaw set, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Maria, her cheek swelling and red from his blow, clutched her rosary. She was no longer a spy. She was a lamb being led to the slaughter, but she had one last, desperate move. As they pulled up to the convent, she saw him, the young, nervous soldier who had delivered the lilies. He was waiting by the gate as instructed by Giulio, but Maria had noticed something about this boy, Nico. He was the one who trembled in the confessional, the one who wept for his sins, the one who still wore a scapular his mother had given him. He was her only chance. As Giulio shoved her from the car, Maria stumbled, falling near the young soldier's feet. Her hand shot out not for balance, but for him. She pressed something small and hard into his palm. It was her silver cigar cutter, the one that had belonged to her father. Nico's eyes widened, his hand closing around it. "My father, Vincenzo," Maria whispered, her voice frantic. "He saved your father in 43. The docks, you know this. This is his marker." The boy froze. It was true. His entire family owed their life to the old Don. "He murdered him, Nico. He murdered my father. The proof, it's in the crypt. Get it. Send it. For your soul." Giulio yanked her to her feet. "Get in the car, bastardo," he snarled at Nico, who scrambled away, his face pale with terror. Giulio, consumed by his own fury, hadn't seen the exchange. He dragged Maria through the convent gates, into the darkened, silent chapel. This, he had decided, would be the stage for his final act. He was no longer just covering his tracks. This was an execution. This was a personal, hateful, and necessary ritual. Maria knew Nico was a fragile hope. He might run. He might tell Giulio. Or, just maybe, the memory of her father and the fear for his own immortal soul would be enough. She had thrown her final, desperate prayer into the void. The chapel was cold, the only light coming from the single red sanctuary lamp glowing by the altar. The air was heavy with the scent of snuffed candles and old incense. Giulio shoved Maria toward the altar, her body stumbling against the marble rail. He was no longer the calculated Don. He was a cornered animal, a monster revealed. You are my family, he spat, his voice echoing in the sacred space. I gave you everything. A life, protection. And you chose him, he jested, over me. I chose God, Maria said, her voice shaking but defiant. You chose a ghost, Giulio laughed, a harsh barking sound. Your father, Vincenzo. You think he was a saint? He began to pace, his rage fueling a final, brutal confession. You think his heart gave out? He was weak. He was soft. He gave too much to the Irish. He let the New York families dictate our terms. He was a peasant in a Don's suit. He stopped, his face inches from hers. His heart didn't give out, Cara. I poisoned him. A little drop every night in his vino, for months. I sat across from him, toasting his health while I watched him die. That is how a Romano rules. Maria, who had suspected for a decade, now faced the sickening, absolute truth. The man who had comforted her at the funeral was the man who had poured the poison. The revelation did not break her. It freed her. The last thread of doubt, the last vestige of family loyalty was severed. She looked at this monster, this creature of pure, profane ego, and felt nothing but an icy finality. She knew she was going to die. But as he raged, she had one purpose left: to buy time, to give Nico, the terrified young soldier, a chance to fulfill her father's marker. She had to keep Giulio here, in the chapel, focused on her, as long as possible. She drew herself up, her gaze steady. You are not a Don, Giulio, she said, her voice quiet but cutting. You are just a coward, a serpent. You poison, you hide. You cannot even bear the sight of a dying man. You are pathetic. The word hit him harder than a bullet. Giulio's face contorted, his civilized mask melting away completely. Pathetic, he hissed. He grabbed the heavy brass altar cross from its stand and swung it, a wild, sacrilegious arc. Maria threw herself backward, the cross smashing into the marble pulpit, sending chips of stone flying. The sound was a cannon shot in the silent church. I built this family from his scraps, Giulio roared, advancing on her. I made us feared. You made us hated, Maria countered, scrambling behind the pews. You broke every rule. You murdered your own blood. You steal from the sick. You are nothing but a disease. He lunged, grabbing her by the habit, his fingers twisting in the heavy wool. He lifted her, her feet dangling, and slammed her against the cold stone wall. Her head hit the wall with a sickening crack. Stars exploded in her vision. He pressed his forearm against her throat, his face a mask of purple rage. You want to see God? He panted, his hot, wine-soaked breath on her face. You want your absolution? Here it is. Maria clawed at his arm, her vision narrowing to a pinprick. She could hear the blood roaring in her ears. She was dying, but she would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. She met his gaze, and in that last, defiant moment, she did the one thing he could not comprehend. She relaxed. She stopped fighting. And with her last choking breath, she whispered the words of the confessional, Ego te absolvo, I forgive you. It was the ultimate defiance. Not a plea for her life, but a judgment on his soul. For a split second, Giulio's rage-filled eyes widened in confusion, in a flicker of superstitious terror. He was not just killing a nun, he was killing a confessor who had just absolved him. The act enraged him beyond reason. He squeezed, a final, convulsive tightening, extinguishing the last spark of her life. Sister Maria Romano, aged 29, went limp in his arms. He held her for a moment, his chest heaving, the silence of the chapel rushing in. Then, with a grunt, He slung her lifeless body over his shoulder. He had one last task. He had to bury his final sin. He carried her down the sacristy steps, through the cellar, and to the false wall. He kicked aside the stones Silas had hastily replaced and descended into the stinking darkness of the crypt. The beam of his flashlight found the space he had reserved for her, a small alcove apart from the others. This, he thought, was fitting. He laid her body on the damp earth. But he wasn't finished. The scene had to be set. This couldn't be a disappearance, it had to be a story of a fallen nun. He retrieved the ledger from where Silas had hidden it in the boiler room, wrapped in an oilcloth. He placed the book in her lap, her Bible of sins. Then he took the .38 revolver, her father's gun, which he had kept as a trophy all these years. He wrapped her cold, stiffening fingers around the grip and laid it beside her. The final touch. A story of suicide, of a woman driven mad by the secrets she'd kept, a fallen bride of Christ. He stepped back, admiring his work. It was perfect. All the evidence, all his sins, and the only two people who knew the full truth, all in one sealed box. He left the crypt, replacing the false wall stone by stone. He mixed a fresh batch of mortar in the cellar, his hands, which had just strangled his niece, now working with the meticulous care of a mason. He sealed the wall, troweling the mortar into every crack, erasing the seam, erasing his sin. He left the convent as the first grey light of dawn touched the sky. He had done it. He was clean. He had buried the past. He didn't know that as he'd been in the crypt. The young soldier, Nico, his hands shaking so badly he could barely stand, had slipped into the boiler room. He hadn't dared enter the crypt, but he had found the oilcloth and the second ledger. The decoy, the one Silas had prepared just in case. It didn't contain the family murders, but it contained everything else, the skimming, the stolen medicine, the names, the dates. Nico took it and ran. He ran all the way to the train station and bought a one-way ticket to New York. Giulio had buried his sin, but the seeds of his destruction were already on their way to the Commissione. The fallout was swift, but silent. 3 weeks later, Don Giulio Romano was summoned to a meeting in New York City. He left the Cafe Venezia in his finest suit, telling his men he'd be back by Sunday. His black sedan was found 2 days later, parked near a shipyard in New Jersey, wiped clean, the keys still in the ignition. Giulio, the Serpent Romano, was never seen again. The North End underworld exhaled, and a new, quieter Don, one approved by the Commissione, took his place. The official story was that Giulio had retired, that he had taken his money and gone back to Sicily. No one believed it, but everyone accepted it. Back in Boston, the archdiocese acted with surgical speed. The suicide of a nun, a story whispered by the abbess who had found the chapel in disarray, was a scandal they could not afford. The convent of St. Agnes was formally condemned, citing structural instability. The remaining nuns were scattered to other parishes, their silence ensured. The building was locked, the gates chained, and the story of Sister Maria Romano was erased. For 71 years, the story faded into a North End legend, a ghost story, until 2024, when the explorers broke that seal. The police, excavating the site, found the rusted gun and the rotted ledger. The ink had run, the pages fused into a solid, unreadable brick of pulp. But as the coroner examined the skeletal remains of Sister Maria, they found something else. Tucked deep within the folds of her woolen habit, protected from the damp by a small waxed silk pouch, was a single, folded page. It was the last page of the ledger, torn out and hidden. It detailed only one thing, written in her perfect, meticulous hand: Genesis 3. The crypt. Isabella Romano, murdered by my uncle Giulio. And tonight, he comes for me. Ego te absolvo. The copy Nico had taken to New York had brought down an empire, but the full truth, the sin that was too dark even for the Commissione, had been buried with her. Her real testimony, her final confession, had waited patiently in the dark, a silent testament to the nun who was too faithful, to her God and to her father, to ever find peace in heaven.